get started a little bit. So when you think of the river and our coast, there's a number of different ways to think about it, when you think about what we use the river for, what we use our coast for. Some people think of the fisheries. You know, we were talking, several of us out there talking today about fishing and maybe what the potential changes might be with the Wanakeri opening again, etc. Some of you may think about navigation, right? So we think about, you know, the big oil tankers that go up and down the Mississippi River. This one's heading down the river right towards Hedda Passes. There's a core dredge wheeler out there, making sure the river stays deep enough for the ships to get through. Some maybe, depending on what industry you're in, you may realize that Louisiana and the Port of Louisiana is the highest in terms of tonnage. And our use as a nation of the Mississippi River, right, to get materials, to get products, both up into the interior of the United States and to get things back out to the rest of the world. Soybeans, you know, automotive parts, etc. So others might think about, especially if you live along the river, you can think about the communities, right? Think about the communities that live along there, the industry that are safe from flooding because of the levees, right? So we think about, you know, we kind of got the ecosystem, we've got the navigation, we've got the protection in terms of from flood risk for our communities and our populations. Others might, you know, if you thought about it a little bit, or you've traveled, you know, realize the Mississippi River Basin is huge, right? It covers about 41% of the United States, continental United States, including a little bit up here into Canada. So what I'm going to talk about over the next, you know, few minutes here is kind of not really how the river formed. That's not really what I'm here to do, but really talk about what we've done in terms of managing some of the different basins, what it's meant in terms of navigation, what it's meant for flood protection, and then I am going to tie it back to really the importance of the Louisiana economy, the people, industries along the river, as well as the coastal issues that we're facing. And then finally, the other part, and I realize a lot of you may also be very concerned or think about the land loss issues that we have. And this is actually what I meant to put up here in terms of turning it back around to the way we've engineered or tried to manage the river and what it means in terms of the projected land loss. And we'll come back to this slide later on. So what I want to start with, and I'm not a geologist, but I do want to take you back about 8,000 years, okay? And glaciers have started retreating. We've got this nice kind of big, I say nice valley, huge area that a lot of the current Mississippi River and the tributaries drained in through. So we had a huge basin funneling a lot of water down. We had sea level conditions such about 8,000 years ago where now the river, as it moved down the topsoil, the sediments, the organic, the trees, the water, the nutrients, all of that, it started forming our coast. And in this case, the Maringouin Delta, you can see here where Baton Rouge currently is. You can actually see 8,000 years ago, roughly, New Orleans was sitting out there in the open water, right? So we start moving our way through, the Maringouin Delta. And then, another couple thousand years later, the Teche Delta, the Teche Lobe. And a lot of these names should be familiar, right? As you drive over interstate, right? You think of, okay, there's Maringouin exit, there's Bayou Teche swimming along the edge. But what I want to stop here for just 1 second and highlight is the distributaries. So while the river came down here and it was actively building land, it was uncontrolled, right? So you had a relatively continuous supply of water and with sediment in some form, as well as nutrients that would nourish all of this, the ecosystem, the wetlands that were out there. And then when the river flooded, when the heavy rain, snow melts, etc. came, then you got that really big pulse of material that then would maybe more significantly build land. But overall, this area would continually get water and nutrient and keep the kind of ecosystem functioning. Then a couple thousand years later, you get the St. Bernard Lobe forming, and now we get that land right where New Orleans is. You fill in the estuary that is called Lake Pontchartrain, right, and then Lake Maurepas eventually. And then again, what do we see? We see the distributaries. So the land, the wetlands are still getting water. They're still getting sediment. They're still getting nutrients. And we plug forward a little further to the Lafourche Lobe, and then eventually we get down to what, in this case, the Plaquemine Lobe, right? So now you start to see something that looks kind of familiar, right? Think of geography and think of a map of the Mississippi River in Louisiana, you start to see, okay, there's a shape that I'm familiar with. And what I want to do is really kind of start here, and we can go back and think about the French settling LaSalle, moving through, into the intercontinent. thinking about how do we connect the Mississippi River, the inner part, what's now the Midwest, to France. We could think about the different settlers that came in, whether they were from England, France, Spain. We could think about, the first people really started settling here in the mid-1600s. They weren't really colonists because they really weren't being supported. They were basically dropped off. I said, okay, figure out how to live here. We'll come back. We'll try to resupply you, but good luck. Okay? And so they call that, in this case, it was basically the Indians, the settlers, and slaves, because you actually had some slaves coming up from Haiti and other areas in the Caribbean that actually also settled in what's now kind of Louisiana, Mississippi Delta. And what was interesting to me is they talk about this time as the frontier exchange economy. Because really it was how do these different groups, how do you figure out how to trade? What is it you can offer that somebody needs? So we start really in the 1600s, but then I'll jump forward more to the 1700s. And now we start to realize people are settling. We've got some settlements in Indiana and in Ohio, the Wabash area, Wabash River in that area. And the French actually in 1705 put 15,000 bear and deer hides. I have beer on my mind too. So bear and deer hides on a raft, took the raft down the Mississippi River, went through what's now Bayou Manchac, through what's now Amite, went through Maurepas, went through Pontchartrain, went to Biloxi. Put those 15,000 hides on a ship, sent it to France. That was 1705. Okay? About a decade after that, then you had Natchez was settled by Fort Grosley up in Natchez. Obviously, then in the mid-1710s, 1715, 1717 time frame, New Orleans, they started building levees. Bienville, right, founded New Orleans. It then became the center of after a couple years of the province of Louisiana. And so you start thinking about, okay, people are starting to use the river, right? We're starting to settle along the river. And obviously now the pressure started, okay, how do we make better use of this? How do we start connecting people and commerce? Then I want to kind of move into the rest of the 1700s, really a period on the river where levees were being built, but they were being built really piecemeal. People that owned property on the river would build their levee. They'd obviously look across and try to figure out, I need to make sure mine's higher than the people across the river from me, right? That kind of stuff. You had some parishes or counties, and entities trying to do some maintenance and build the levees on their own, but really it was piecemeal all around. And you also then had, kind of the advent or the use of the flatboats and then later on the keel boats on the river. But so really through the 1700s, you started to see more and more of the levees, quasi-levees being built. You saw more and more use of the river, but the problem right now was, which way do these basically go? They only come downriver. Keel boats can go back up, right? But it takes, I can't even imagine, right? Okay, we whine about some of the things we do today, right? You can imagine taking a keel boat up, averaging about 1 mile an hour, I think they said, at best. But we started to see a little bit of trade back and forth. Most of it was coming down. Basically, you get this spot boat down there, what would they do? Basically sell the lumber, right? You unload everything, sell the lumber, and then send another one down. And then the keel boats were exactly, they try to move up and down. So we kind of moved now through the end of the 1700s, right? So we've got piecemeal levees, we've got some protection here and there for people in some of the communities, and then we've got one-way traffic. And then we move into the early 1800s. So Fulton and Livingston, right here, they basically built the first steamboat up and they demonstrated its ability to navigate both upstream and downstream up in the northeast United States. And as soon as they were convinced and proved they could do it, they immediately set their sights on the Mississippi River. Because they realized this is where the real money's going to be, right? And so what they did was they commissioned Roosevelt, who was an uncle of Teddy Roosevelt, to build and pilot the USS New Orleans. So the USS New Orleans was built in Pittsburgh, and in about mid-1811, Roosevelt, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, I should say his pregnant wife, their 2-year-old daughter, their dog, and about 6 crew hands, deck hands, got on the USS New Orleans, left Pittsburgh, got as far as about Louisville before they had to stop. And because the water was relatively low and there were a lot of rapids, they couldn't get through. And I'm going to come back to that here in a second. So they ended up stopping in Louisville, and he used that opportunity to go back up and down the river. He basically wanted to see how easy was it to get up and down the river. So he kind of used that time to demonstrate to himself and to get a feel for the USS New Orleans. And I should also mention, while they were stuck here in Louisville, his wife had a baby, and then they continued down the river. I was like, my wife would kill me. Okay, no. So in early 1812, they made it to New Orleans. So they basically demonstrated you get down the river. For the next 2 years, the USS New Orleans went back up. We basically went from New Orleans up to Natchez, back and forth a couple times. In 1814, it sunk. Okay, 1814, it sunk. Which back then, I don't know the statistics, but that's probably actually 2 years for a steamboat on the Mississippi may have actually been a long time. I never know. I should say don't know. Okay, next person we want to talk about. So now Fulton and Livingston proved or built this had this steamboat commissioned. They built it. They demonstrated it would work. They even tried to get a monopoly on the use of steamboats on the Mississippi River. So they said, we've got a monopoly. They filed in some court saying we have this. And then came along Henry Shreve. He had already piloted a number of keelboats up and down the river in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So he actually was commissioned or brought on to pilot, in this case, I forget which one, the Enterprise. So again, someone else built a steamboat. They hired him. He brought the steamboat from Pittsburgh area down to New Orleans. And then he spent the next couple years basically working out how to get up and down the river faster and faster. And so what he basically did was he took the time, or he figured out how to navigate it better, what routes to use through the river. And as an example, I think in early 1800s, it took the speed record from New Orleans to Louisville was probably 2-3 months. And within about 20 years, he got it down to about 6 days. Right? So now what I want you to start thinking about now is all of a sudden it's not only can we do it, now we're cutting the time from months to days, okay, to get from Louisville, New Orleans, etc. Also, then you start thinking about, well, now they can do that. The number of steamboats on the river went from a couple dozen in the late 1815, 1820, to several hundred, if not 1,000, by 1850. So now you start thinking, okay, now we've got the steamboats, we can go up and down. Now we've got a lot more of them. And all of a sudden, we basically had the Amazon of 1850s, right, where you had what they call packet boats, and those were then those regularly scheduled ships that would go up and down, and you could put goods on there and trade. So that Henry Shreve actually kind of got his start on that, and that's where he started thinking a lot about the issues with snagging in the trees, right? So that's how we know of getting rid of the great raft in Shreveport, right, in the Red River. So after he did that for a couple of years, and it took some time because of politics, but he eventually got a contract with the Corps of Engineers and to build the ship of his dreams, which is this vessel here that basically floats, pretty shallow vessel here, that you basically can move up onto the trees, onto the limbs and the trees there, and basically pull them up, cut them, right, and basically clear out the river. And so he was able to do that first on the Mississippi River, demonstrated it would work, and then got a huge contract and basically spent most of his time over at Shreveport, right, clearing out the great raft. And so that's where we kind of think of Henry Shreve. And then this is just a picture from the packet boats, right? So once they got the steamboats, they demonstrated up and down the river. We had a lot more of them. Now you get this regular service going up and down the river. Okay? So the pressures became more and more on the navigation industry. And then those of you who've read Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi, you read about how tough it's, even though we think, well, you've got the steamboats, you've got the power, etc. But the Mississippi was still pretty wild at that point, right? You had a lot of cutoffs, you had a very dynamic system. You didn't necessarily know how much water was coming down, how many days you had, until the water was going to rise or come back down. So it was still pretty wild, and the federal government started taking interest in this. Okay? So the federal government took an interest in, we need to start figuring out how to better, I guess the word, manage the river. Okay? And so what they did was they said, okay, we're going to put aside $50,000, and they were also worried a lot about flooding. So it wasn't just the navigation, it was also flood control. Now I'm going to come back to that conundrum here in a little bit. So they put $50,000 aside and said, we want somebody to study the river and tell us what we can do to maintain navigation and to kind of reduce risk. Keep navigation sustainable, reduce the flood risk. And it was all going to go to the Army Corps of Engineers, to an Army Corps of Engineers officer. But there was some big push from the civilian engineers. So up until the mid-1800s, most engineers in the country were all trained at West Point. Okay? But you had a few that were trained in Europe, and then they started some more engineering universities or programs. And so you had slowly had more of a civilian engineering population. And so the federal, I forget who was in charge at that point, they basically split the money. And what they did was they gave $25,000 to Ellett, and they gave $25,000 to Humphreys. They said, okay, you two, go off independently and figure out what we need, how we can basically better manage, control the river. Ellett was a European-trained, French-trained engineer. He's an American citizen, but went off to Europe to get trained. He spent 2 years. He just said, this is my job. I got a 2-year contract, basically. He went out, he studied it, he made a lot of observations, and he wrote a report. He basically said, look, we have to let the river grow. We need to have room. We need to have outlets. So when the river gets high, there's a lot of flood waters coming out. We need to release that water out into spillways and outlets. And that was his recommendation. Then you had Humphreys, who was a Corps of Engineers, very egotistical engineer, I should say, driven. He took his approach to the river and studying the river in a completely different way. He and Abbott, one of his engineering partners, spent years studying the river. They collected so much data. They wrote a 700-page report, basically, about the river. I say 700. It could be 500. I don't know, but it's a long report. But they spent a lot of time studying it. What's interesting is he didn't necessarily disagree with what Ellett proposed. He just refused to publicly ever admit that anything Ellett said was true. Okay? So this is a little bit where we get into the ego part of this, right? And that Humphreys realized, and a lot of the thinking of the time was from I think it's the Po River in Italy, I think it is. They basically did some studies and studied it, and they had very constricted valleys there. And they were able to see that because they constrained the river, it scoured out, it maintained some depth, and they didn't have as many flooding issues. The problem was the geography, and I think some of the sedimentary processes were completely different. But that idea of levees controlling the river was what basically a lot of people in the federal government wanted. And so Ellett said outlets, Humphrey said a bunch of different things, but he basically would never say outlets, okay? And then came along James Buchanan Eads, who was actually made a fortune off of salvaging sunken ships in the Mississippi River. And he also then, later on in life, built the first steel bridge across the Mississippi River in St. Louis. So he was very much a hands-on person. He actually invented a diving bell to go down in the river to salvage ships. So he not only was genius, very smart, self-educated, he also spent time at the bottom of the river, physically at the bottom of the river, feeling the way things moved. And that gave him a perspective on things that was really unique. So he came along and started proposing some ideas and basically said, we need to build jetties. And the idea of the jetties is you put these structures along the river that constrain the flow, most of the flow between them. Right? So if my river's this wide, if I put jetties in this far, then all the water's kind of forced to go between here. Higher velocities, it scours sediment, keeps it deep. Well, so that's really what he recommended, and I'm going to come back to that idea within the river in a second. But where he kind of made his fame, or the idea of the jetties, really demonstrated their possibilities, and also opened up a whole lot of possibilities for the United States, was in South Pass here. So this is the lower, roughly 20, 30 miles of the Mississippi River. What we now know is Southwest Pass, South Pass here. So Eads said, the federal government again came and said, we need to open this up. What happened was, as we showed, remember the pictures I showed at the beginning with the delta, the river going back and forth? Well, over time, you just start, this all silts in. And the channels are not deep enough for ships to get in and out on a regular basis. So the federal government said, we need to open this up. In fact, the port of New Orleans was actually starting to decline as far as its importance as a port because people along in Louisville and Pittsburgh and other places were like, why should I go all the way down to New Orleans if I can't get out? Right? I mean, there's this trade between them. Really, the value was to be able to get out also. So they basically, the federal government Eads went to the federal government and said, look, I will self-fund, I think it was $10 million, a project that I'm going to build jetties along Southwest Pass, and I'm going to demonstrate that these will self-maintain. They will stay deep enough, and they will have ships moving in and out. As a matter of fact, he said you can have two-way traffic going. Humphreys, right, the ego, right, he politicked and basically got them to say, well, no, don't do Southwest Pass, because Humphreys was hoping he would get that one. He made Eads, he forced them to tell Eads that he could do South Pass. And so Eads went out there with a crew, and again, imagine taking a crew in 1870s, to the very end of the Mississippi River, and basically constructing on willow mats and piles these jetties. Okay? And so Eads demonstrated, basically was able to demonstrate that he could keep the South Pass open and deep and have two-way traffic. He almost went bankrupt doing it, but eventually he proved it would work and he got his money. But the point here is that when the jetties opened, and again, revived the declining port, in 1875, before the jetties, 6,900 tons of goods went from St. Louis to France. After the jetties were open, 455,000 tons. Does that make sense, right? So all of a sudden you open up, then we got steamboats going both ways. Now we've opened up South Pass. Now all of a sudden, everything's wide open, right? So the economy now can kickstart and go up orders of magnitude in the reach, both within the Midwest and internationally, is tremendous. So what confused the issue here wasn't the fact that the success of the jetties. It was the fact that too many people who didn't understand Eads said, well, if the jetties work, then that means levees only policy will work on the Mississippi River. Their idea was, if we build levees along the river, we make them high enough, we'll constrain the water, and it'll go fast, and it'll scour out, and it'll stay deep, and people won't flood. The problem is, jetties actually stick out in the bottom, typically in the bottom or middle kind of depths, and keep the water flowing fast there. Whereas too many of the levees on the Mississippi River were built away from the main channel, and so they didn't really help at all in terms of focusing and concentrating. So what happened after, so this is where the federal government, the courts decided to go, let's go federal, let's go more with the levees only policy. So the other thing that happened about this time was the federal government started to take a look at how do they fund programs, okay? And what happened was they realized communities and industries were flooding, but the federal government said, constitutionally, we should not be funding flood protection. That should be individual states or areas. But people started thinking, well, wait a minute, if we build levees and convince people that the levees will maintain navigation, right, then we get the benefit of flood protection. So that's the other part of this whole levees only policy, it was sold as a way to maintain navigation, but at the same time, really, they would provide flood protection. And so what happened over the next, 30, 40 years was, the federal government came in and said, okay, we want a navigation channel then between the mouth of the Mississippi River and Cairo, Illinois. So they started saying, okay, now we've got navigation. Now we need to invest in here. 250-foot wide, 9-foot deep channel, or maintain that. Levees started to go up and get higher and higher and higher and higher. And the problem was people weren't fast enough to react to, well, the levees needed to get higher and higher and higher and higher. Nobody said, wait a minute, this probably means it's not working, right? Until when? Until 1927, right? Okay? And so the 1927 flood basically, displaced over 500,000 people, hundreds of square miles underwater. probably the first time the federal government really stepped in as far as national aid, federal aid to states and local communities. And this is really then when the president signs the flood control measure. And basically at that point, it's like, okay, levees only is not working, right? Levees only is not working. So what do we do? And that's where you get the Jagwin plan. If you've heard of that, he was the Army Corps of Engineers. He was head of the Army Corps of Engineers after the 27 flood. And basically they started putting together a plan. And they're like, okay, we can't just do levees. We've got to do outlets. We've got to look at other strategies. And so for the next 20, 30 years, that plan was put into place. The Waterways Experiment Station in Vicksburg was developed to really do some studies that would help the design of some of the structures that we have on the Mississippi River now. And I just put these 2 stars here because also what happened is, once they realized, this is pretty good from here to Cairo, and basically let's extend those all the way up to Minneapolis. So now you've got the navigation, the Corps maintaining navigation, not just the lower part, but all the way up to Minneapolis. Okay? So let's keep going a little bit. Now, the problem with the Jagwin plan was their outlets. They're like, okay, we're not going to build levees, we're not going to keep building them higher and higher, we're going to start putting outlets, like Bonnie Carey, Old River. But there was the plan still had a major outlet or floodway that was going to impact a lot of Louisiana and Arkansas. Okay? And so there was a lot of back and forth, and a lot of engineers got involved in this study of cutoffs. And basically what happened was, historically the river, would do this, right, meander, right? And what they realized was, wait a minute, if we can cut this off, right, so have the river go from here to here, okay, we can increase the slope, we can get the water to flow through there, you increase the slope, it scours out, it keeps the river sediment moving. And so, by basically removing about 150 miles of river, okay, realize these aren't, this is not 100 meters, 100 yards from here to here. We're talking about miles, right, in these things. But by basically removing 150 or so miles of the river, they were able to actually take one of the outlets, the outlet that was going to flood a lot of Arkansas, Louisiana, out of the plan. So they shortened the river in order to basically remove an outlet, which then obviously is a great benefit to the state. So we have the cutoffs, and there are books written just on the cutoffs and the impact on the river. Locks and dams along the Ohio River. I brought this up also. We're going to go back to the idea right from this. Roosevelt was coming down, right? He had to stop and basically wait for the water to come back up because there were too many rapids and he couldn't get down through there. Well, the locks and dams allow you to basically bypass those, right? So I also put this up here because I grew up right there. Okay, there. So I was born in the Mississippi River Basin. Okay, so okay, sorry. And we also have the Bonnie Carey Spillway, right? So we have a lot of lock and dams up above, and now we've got basically a bunch of outlets down below. So we've got the old river control structure, and then the Bonnie Carey Spillway, right? That we're all very familiar with, and will probably open tomorrow, right? So let's go back for a second. So now, we started with the whole pre-1600s river distributaries, right? Feeding the wetlands, all that good stuff. We started using more and more of the river, so we levied it off, and what happens? All those distributaries go away, right? Because basically we're not providing those wetlands any fresh water, we're not providing any nutrients, any organic material. They're not even inorganic, like the sand or any of those type of materials. So that goes away, and then what happens? We basically have this land loss issue, right? It's because we've cut the river off. Now, so review for a second. Oh, I sound like a professor. Okay, now, so, what do we end up with? Because of what we've done, we've ended up with a major land loss issue. So the CPR, the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority, and the 2017 Coastal Master Plan, they basically went and said, look, we lost about 2,000 square miles in the last 80 years, and in the next 50 years, if we don't do anything, we're going to probably lose another 4,000 square miles. And I think that's about what's shown here. Okay? So, we got a land loss problem in our state because we basically cut the river off, right? Cut the river off from the wetlands. Now, is any of this expected? Or unexpected, I should say. So, not necessarily. So, in 1897, a Corps of Engineers employee, an engineer with the Corps, wrote an article in National Geographic where he basically said the great benefit to the president and 2 or 3 generations accruing from a complete system of absolutely protected levees. It's very much that's a pretty arrogant statement, isn't it, by the way? Excluding the floodwaters entirely far outweighs the disadvantages from the subsidence of the Gulf Delta lands. So in 1897, people knew that basically the economy, keeping people safe, and for navigation, it was worth cutting off the wetlands. And then we'll let our kids handle it, okay? Right? Or their kids of kids now. I don't know how many generations we are now. But so, again, not necessarily unexpected. So we've gone from this beautiful, meandering river, right, to very much an engineered system, right? Okay, so again, what the benefits? Benefit is all these ports, all the ports along in South Louisiana, right? ExxonMobil is not going to be in Baton Rouge, right, without the river, right? The economy of Louisiana is so tied to all these ports along the Mississippi River. The flood protection. So I actually just pulled this off of Facebook or Twitter today. Louisiana Coastal Geology Group, they actually posted this today. They said the river at Carrollton Gauge in New Orleans is at 15.5 feet. That's this. There's the Mississippi River levee. You come through New Orleans, there's the Metairie Ridge, mean Gulf level. Here's the level of Lake Pontchartrain. Now, obviously, this is, it's distorted in scale, but you get the point, don't you? Right? 15.5 feet, 0. Right? Okay, so navigation, we've got a lot of industry, a lot of people rely upon it. We've got flood risk, we've got flood protection, right here, right? Matter of fact, we don't want this to get much higher, that's why Bonnie Carey's opening tomorrow. We're going to start opening it. So we've got the land loss, we've got navigation, we've got flood protection. And what I want to kind of wrap up with is talking about what the state's doing about it, what the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority is doing about it. So the state every 5 years, and now it's going to be 6, has to develop a science and engineering-based plan for restoring and protecting our people on our coast. And so they've got a comprehensive plan at how to use the river and its resources, as well as other sand and material off the coast, and engineering structures and non-structural features to protect people and restore our coast. So the state has a very, very, very good plan in place to combat, or at least, let's say, keep up with the stresses and the pressures from the land loss in the Gulf Coast. So, what I want to do right here for the last 2 minutes or so is say, okay, let's wrap this up and now get you excited to come to the center. Okay? So what I've done is just to give you the history a little bit more, right? At least Clint's version of the history. But the Center for River Studies, so we're located on the Baton Rouge Water Campus. Okay, so we're only about 1.5 miles up the road here, just south of the bridge. We are not the building that's over the levee or over the river. So try not to be so disappointed if you come out to the building and go, I really thought I was coming out to look over the river. I'm like, well, you are looking over the model. That's not the same. Okay, so the LSU Center for River Studies, we're right next door to the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority, who's been our partner, and I've been working with them for 16 years or so almost. So what do we do there? We give tours and have educational events. So talking about our deltaic coast, as well as the different projects that CPRA is doing. We talk about the river, we talk about the issues and the stresses on our coast. We also talk a lot about the master plan and basically trying to inform the public about the important work the state and LSU are doing together in terms of our restoration and protection. And then we also have some exhibits and some things that we try to also push students in terms of, hey, you're interested in the coast, you want to be a coastal warrior, how do you get involved? And it isn't all just about being an engineer or a coastal scientist. We basically are telling them, look, there's policy, there's communication, and we really try to emphasize that when students come out here. But the other part of the center is the physical model. So if you went to Google Earth and you said, okay, I'm going to go to about 10,000 feet and I'm going to look down the Mississippi River. So this is Donaldsonville right here, right? So about halfway between here and New Orleans. Donaldsonville, You see, this is Lake Pontchartrain, the Bonnet spillways right here. New Orleans is here. Buras down this way, so this is the Gulf of Mexico. So this is the river, right? Google Earth. I then go to the physical model and I take a picture, okay? And so this is a picture of the actual physical model of the Mississippi. So a model, we have the riverbed routed into high-density foam panels, and I highlighted a few of the locations. Donaldsonville, right? There's St. James, Maurepas Swamp, LaPlace, Port Sulphur, right? So it's a one-to-one, not a one-to-one replica, it's a scaled replica of the Mississippi River. Okay? It's a scale where we can then do experiments to look at how the river is going to respond to different natural or man-made processes or features, management strategies. And so that's what we're doing, we're using the model for, and then we're feeding that information, working with the CPRA so they can use that in terms of their coastal master plan and in designing better projects. You also could go Google Earth if you went to the Gulf of Mexico, right? Rotate everything, go up a little higher and say, oh, there's the Gulf of Mexico, there's the Burnfoot, right? There's Southwest Pass, New Orleans, etc. Well, you come out to the physical model, there you see it, right? I'm standing up on the catwalk on the second floor looking down on the physical model, and there's Southwest Pass, and there's the river running up there. Put this up there also to highlight that there are 20 high-resolution projectors in the physical model. So not only do we talk about the research and the model and the work we're doing, we also, in the CPRA, is put some really some neat animations and product content together to also use this as an outreach and education tool. To really educate and communicate about the work they're doing and the issues we're facing. So with that, I just want to kind of finish up with, for thanking some people, obviously the CPRA partners, Alden Labs built the model. We've got Ardora and some others in terms of collaboration with the model. I have to give a shout out to the Honors College only because I've got to teach. I got to teach a couple classes that pushed me into the part of the Mississippi River history that I'm not sure I ever would have gotten into. But it's been a lot of fun.